Hopefully Christianity is something that we're not interested in just as a curiosity. Hopefully it has an effect on how we live our lives. And I guess every one of us in here comes from either a Protestant or a Roman Catholic background. And in Protestant and Roman Catholic Christianity, the tendency has always been to concentrate on sin. And Protestants and Roman Catholics have a tendency to see everything Jesus did as being about sin. And they have tended to make Christianity all about getting your sins forgiven. And because of that, many Christians seem to have an obsession with sin. I've been in churches before where they did a confession of sin at the beginning, near the beginning of every service. And I've noticed that up around where we live, if you go to any kind of church supper or even a family gathering where they have a meal and they're going to have a blessing before the meal, when someone asks the blessing, more often than not, that blessing of the meal will include asking God to forgive our sins. It's almost like people are obsessed with sin and getting it forgiven. And so if you're obsessed with sin and getting it forgiven, then naturally the focus of everything is on sin. And if we focus on sin all the time, we may get to the point where we see the Christian life as being solely about avoiding sin. If you live life avoiding sin, then you live a Christian life. And, I can't criticize that completely because there is a lot in the Bible that talks about avoiding sin. In Mark chapter 7, Jesus lists things that we should not do. He lists evil thoughts, adultery, fornication, murder, theft, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. And Jesus himself said to avoid those things. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, the Apostle Paul listed things to avoid: idolatry, adultery, homosexuality, thievery, greed, drunkenness, swindling. And he says, if you do these things, you will not go to heaven. In Galatians chapter 5, the Apostle Paul has another list. This one is idolatry, sorcery, hatred, discord, jealousy, rage, rivalry, division, factions, envy, drunkenness, carousing. And again, he says, if you do these things, you will not go to heaven. And so there's no doubt that in the Bible that avoiding sin is emphasized. In fact, Jesus at one point talked so strongly about avoiding sin that he said that if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. It's that important to avoid sin. And so when you think of living a Christian life, avoiding sin is important. But I think if we concentrate solely on that, we'll get the false idea that avoiding sin is all there is to living a Christian life. And we'll get the idea that righteousness means that you avoid doing wrong things. We'll have a list of sins, and granted, that list of sins varies for different Christians, but whatever your list of sins is, we'll have that list of sins, and if we avoid those things, we'll think we're righteous. And so for many people, the Christian life means not doing wrong things. And that idea comes from the Protestant and Roman Catholic emphasis on sin. Now, in that kind of Christianity, morality and righteousness are defined not by what you do, but by what you do not do. In this kind of Christianity, the Christian life is passive. It is not defined by what you actively do. It is defined what you do not do. If you avoid doing certain things, then you're righteous. Now, that concentration on sin in Roman Catholic and Protestant Christianity has always bothered me. And I don't think Christianity should revolve around sin. If we can get rid of our obsession with sin and not create a religion where everything revolves around sin, maybe we can see the Christian life as being more than just avoiding sin. Maybe we need to look at the Christian life as being more about what you do rather than what you do not do. Now, although the Bible does talk about in numerous places things we should not do, it also talks in numerous places about things we should do. For our gospel reading, we heard from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And we did this. Our Sermon on the Mount is actually technically Sermon on the Plain. Our version was from Luke, but it's the same ideas as the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus spent a lot of time talking about things we do. He talks about going the second mile. He talks about lending to those who want to borrow. He talks about loving your enemies. He talks about praying for your enemies. Jesus goes on to talk about how you should lay up treasure in heaven. He talks about bearing fruit. And the implication when Jesus talks about bearing fruit in the Gospels, it's things you do. It's not avoiding things. Bearing fruit is producing something, doing something. Jesus talks about feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, visiting prisoners, and giving to the poor. He talks about getting along with people. Now, the Apostle Paul, who we talked about earlier, who listed all those things not to do, also talked about things that we should do. He talks about loving each other. He talks about being joyful. He talks about being at peace. He talks about having forbearance, and that means being patient and the ability to deal with people without blowing up. The Apostle Paul talks about being kind to each other. He talks about being good. He talks about being faithful. He talks about being gentle. And all those are things that we do. They illustrate that the Christian life does just not consist in not doing things. It also consists in doing things. Now, we today, coming from Protestant and Roman Catholic backgrounds, are not the only people who have fallen in the trap of thinking that Christianity consists of what you do not do. We see that the people in the Old Testament had the same problem. In the Old Testament, in the latter part of the Old Testament, the Jews got the temple finally during the time of Solomon. And somewhere along the line, they developed the idea that as long as they followed these prescribed rituals in the temple and went through all those services in the temple, everything was fine. They got the idea that as long as they did not do the thou shalt nots, everything was fine. As long as they did the rituals, and as long as they avoided the list of sins, they were fine. They had their list of things they should not do, and they didn't do them, and they thought they were okay. But when we get to the book of Amos, we find out that that's not how God looked at it at all. The book of Amos talks about them as being fat cows. The book of Amos criticizes them because they have summer houses and winter houses. They have houses made of expensive materials, but they oppress the poor. They crush the needy. They tread down the poor and burden them with all kinds of taxes. Yes, they bring their sacrifices to the temple. Yes, they go through all the rituals. They keep the Sabbath. They do all of this stuff. They love to have all these services at the temple. But then they lie on beds of ivory. They stretch out on their couches. They feast on lamb and fatted calves. They while away their hours sipping wine and listening to music. They put perfume on themselves. They have big meals. They love to live it up. And they're blind to the afflictions that other people are going through. You see, they keep the letter of the law in that they avoid the thou shalt nots. And they perform all the right services and all in the temple. But they have neglected love. They have neglected others. They have neglected mercy. They have concentrated on the things not to do. They have neglected the things to do. For our reading from Isaiah this morning, we saw much the same ideas we see in the book of Amos. The people have all these services in the temple. We see how God's talking about all the services you have, all the festivals you have, all the things you do to supposedly worship me, and God says, I don't want any of it. I don't want any of it. The first chapter of Isaiah portrays them as saying they're haughty, they're proud, they're rich, they prance around dressed in finery. They think they're so religious because they don't do the thou shalt nots and because they keep all the rituals and go to all the services. But God says, I cannot bear this. It's an abomination. You see, they don't seek justice. They don't rebuke the oppressor. They don't defend the fatherless. They don't plead for the widow. And God says, I've had it with you. I just can't take it anymore. You see, they misunderstood. They thought righteousness means avoiding doing bad things. They didn't realize that righteousness means doing good things. You see, the righteousness that God wanted was not for them to avoid sin. The righteousness God wanted was for them to do good things. The righteousness God wanted was not passive. It was actively doing. Now, sometimes people talk about how the teachings of Jesus are so complicated, and they are. You know, Juan and I read them, and we sit there and say, what in the world does that mean? You know, there was one whole chapter in John that one night I said, I've just given up on this one. You know, that I have no idea what to do with that. And so, you know, sometimes the teachings of Jesus are very, very hard to understand. But one of the things I've noticed is that a lot of the times you can distill most of the teachings of Jesus down to one thing: how you treat other people. And that's true. I know there's a lot that's hard to understand, and I don't know what that means, but that I can understand. A lot of it you can distill down: how you treat other people. And it's not just the ones you like. It's not just the ones who like you. You've got to treat everyone with love, no matter whether you like them or not, no matter if you agree with them or not, no matter if they have the same opinions and viewpoints as you have or not. You've got to treat them all with love, and no matter whether they like you or not either. You see, according to Jesus, it's how you treat the people you don't like and how you treat the people who don't treat you well that determines what kind of person you really are, because he says even the sinners love those who love them. Even the sinners treat the people well who treat them well. But the real crux of it is how you treat the people you don't like and how you treat the people who don't treat you well. The book of 1 John makes it plain. He who hates his brother is in darkness. If someone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? You can't get any plainer than that. In the Gospels is the account of a rich young man who comes up to Jesus wanting to know, what do I have to do to receive eternal life? And Jesus said, well, keep the commandments. And the man said, I've done that. He kept the commandments. Jesus said, well, you lack one thing. Go sell what you have and give to the poor, and come and follow me. And it said the man turned and walked away. He could not do that. He could follow the commandments. He could follow the thou shalt nots. But he would not follow Jesus. Sometimes people misinterpret that and think that the main thrust of what Jesus said to him was, go sell what you have and give to the poor. But I don't believe that's what it was. I think the main thrust of it is, follow me. And you see, that's what the man would not do. He would keep the commandments, but he would not follow Jesus. He would avoid the things he was supposed to avoid, but he would not do actively the things that he needed to do. You see, there are things in the Bible that indicate that how we act toward other people will determine how God acts toward us. If you'll remember the parable of the unmerciful servant, A man owed his master a huge sum of money and went in, and the master said, I'm going to sell you and your family into slavery until this debt's paid. The man said, oh, please don't do that. I'll pay you. Just begged and begged them. Okay, I'll forgive the debt. So he got that huge debt forgiven to him. Then he went out, and he saw a fellow servant that owed him a few pennies, and he said, pay me what you owe me. And the guy couldn't pay, and he had him thrown into prison. And so the master heard about what he'd done. He called the guy, and he said, after I forgave you this huge debt, could you go out here and have this guy thrown into prison for owing you just a pittance? And he said he delivered him over to the torturers until every last dime was paid. And Jesus ended that parable that's saying that's how God will treat us unless we forgive others. Jesus said, the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. That's one of the most ominous things, I think, in the whole Bible, or should be, for many people in the world today. But that's where we get into trouble. We're tempted to say, well, that's fine, it's okay. Let God use the same measure for me. See, I'm a sinner. But I don't do bad sins like a lot of other people do. I haven't done the bad things I won't forgive people for. I might do some bad things, but mine are minor compared to the bad things others done. So let God use the same criteria for me as I do for them. I'll be okay because I'll pass with flying colors. You see, very few people who will not forgive other people, and very few people who sit in judgment upon other people would say that they're perfect themselves. I bet it'd be hard to find a person that when pressed would say, I'm perfect and I don't never do anything wrong. But I bet you in our society today it'd be easy to find people that say, well, I might not be perfect, but I haven't done anything near as bad as these people over here are doing. I hadn't done anything near as bad as they're doing. So let God use the same measure to judge me. I'll come out okay. I think that's a good point to make about judging others. But did you notice what we did? We slipped back into that old thing of making it all about sin. You see, we interpreted it in relation to sin because that's what we always do. That's what we've been taught to do. And there's no denying there is an aspect of that in that parable. But I think there's also another aspect that we miss. When Jesus said, with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. We could look at that as being about sin and the fact that if we forgive others, we'll be forgiven. But what if we look at it in another way, not necessarily about sin? What if we look at the measure you use as being the good things you do for others? Do we do good things for others with a full cup running over to pour out on them? Or do we do good things for others who just put just a couple of drops in that cup and just let it drip out on them? Do we do for others until it hurts? Do we do for others until it costs us something? Or do we do for others only a little out of our abundance? In the Gospels is the account of how Jesus was watching people put money into the temple treasury. And some people came by and they put in a huge amount of money. One old woman came up and she dropped 2 little coins in there. And Jesus said she put in more than all the others because they just put in some of what they had left over, where she put in all she had to live on. You see, they just gave out of their abundance, but she gave until it hurt. After they had their wants satisfied, they gave a little out of what they had left over, but she gave everything. Is that how we do for others? Do we do for others until it hurts and until it costs us something? Or do we just do for others a little bit after we've had all we want and there's a little left over, we'll give them a crumb? Is what we do for others something significant and represents a significant sacrifice to us? Or is it just an afterthought, like throwing the change back on the counter after you've paid a $40.95 bill and you put the nickel on the table and you think you've done something big? You see, we've talked about two things today. Avoiding doing wrong is one of them, and I do think that's important. But we've also talked about doing good and doing for others. And I think that's even more important. The reason I think that is something from the book of 1 Peter, and it says this: above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. Love covers a multitude of sins.